I Am Not Listening is a prototype for an audio vibrotactile object, a poem object, in which the interpretative space between the oral, visual, and haptic is exposed and activated by the audience through manipulation of the object. My name is Ana Cavic. I am an artist and PhD candidate at University of Southampton, and I will be presenting on behalf of my collaborators, Tychonas Michailidis, lecturer in digital technologies based at Birmingham City University, and Sally Morfill, artist and senior lecturer at Manchester School of Art. I Am Not Listening exists within the context of the evolution of artists' publications and publishing activities throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. We are proposing how a poem object can exist as a hybrid publication in the post-digital era. In this presentation, we're going to talk about where this work is placed within other works, followed up with the theoretical background that reflects on the work. We are then going to talk about the creative process and the development of the work, and we'll conclude with some thoughts as to how digital technologies can enhance the reader's experience. The term poem objet or poem object was coined by the surrealist writer André Breton to describe a series of text, image, and object assemblages he produced in the 1930s and 1940s, a hybrid format of his own invention. Breton made about a dozen assemblages. These are two examples. He defined these works in his 1928 book Surrealism and Painting as a means of combining the resources of poetry and sculpture and in speculating on their reciprocal powers of exaltation. The text on the plaster egg in the poem object on the left translates as I see, I imagine. The poem inscribed beneath is deliberately cryptic. The poem object on the right features a poem that describes a nighttime scene with lovers floating along on the Mediterranean Sea, and it's scattered among the objects and images, a perfume flask, pipe cleaners, a seahorse, and a ceramic piece, all mounted in a lady's headdress box. All these elements are arranged in imitation of the subject matter. Broadly speaking, Breton's poem objects belong within a pre-existing tradition of visual poetry, whereby the poem's meaning emerges in the act of looking as much as in the act of reading. This dual operation is thought to activate the imagination and put the viewer in a frame of mind ripe for the production of plural meanings. Artists and poets such as Raymond Queneau embrace the dynamic, interactive possibilities offered by an altogether different category of poem objects, wherein the crucial difference is that they are objects to be handled and interacted with. Originally published in French in 1961, the first version of Queneau's 100,000 billion poems in English, pictured, was published in 1983 in a limited edition of 500 copies. There are 10 sonnets, one on each page, which is cut into 14 strips, one for each line. Thus, there are 10 sonnets to the power of 14 combinations that can be assembled by the reader at will, simply by turning the strips. The combinations total up to the number of poems indicated in the title, with an estimated 2 million years needed to read all the possible combinations. Alessandro Ludovico has pointed out, here, a natural gesture, moving strips as if they were sub-pages, becomes a process in the hands and eyes of the reader who can endlessly create not just a combinatory type of content, but truly unexpected poetry. 100,000 billion poems emphasizes the haptic dimension of reading and points towards a gestural reading that we are trying to make explicit in I Am Not Listening through a digitally augmented interactive interface. I Am Not Listening engages with Ludovico's conception of hybrid and processual publications, challenging what constitutes both a publication and an act of publishing by dispensing with the notion of a publication as the end goal of making all together. Instead, publishing is reimagined, first and foremost, as a performative gesture of reading. I Am Not Listening utilizes vibrotactile technology and digitally augmented sound to expand the sensory dimension of the reading experience, allowing the user to manipulate the audio and haptic feedback via its interactive interface. The work expands the experiential dimension of poetry reading beyond the conventions of the printed page and towards a performative gesture of reading, in which the interpretative experience between the oral, visual, and haptic are exposed and activated, and in which no two performed readings are the same. I Am Not Listening is capable of producing multiple readings and acts of publishing through audience interaction, whereby the user's gestures can activate and augment the audio and receive vibrotactile feedback. The poem object's interactive features are activated through handling in such a way that leads to the performance of further gestures that are, in a sense, translations and amplifications of the original gestures it contains. The gestural underpinning of I Am Not Listening is rooted in an earlier collaboration, the naturalness of strange things. This initial inquiry was made with reference to the 20th century Belgian writer and artist Henri Michaud, and specifically, as Laurent Jenny notes, to his aim to reconcile writing and drawing, which after all are both attributes of the same line. Michaud's early drawing alphabet, pictured, is a form of asemic writing in which literary meaning is elusive. He had an early aspiration to develop a universal language. However, readings of drawings such as this will necessarily be open-ended and inconclusive in terms of their meaning. This highlighted section of Michaud's drawing became the focus for an exercise in redrawing. A visual analysis suggests that alphabet was drawn with fluency, much like handwriting. Given Michaud's interest in physical movement and rhythmic gesture, our exercise in redrawing was less an effort to accurately copy his lines, but instead, through repetition, to try and emulate the kind of gestures he made in what we perceived to be quick and rhythmic way. There was, of course, great variance between each of the redrawing attempts. There was also significant difference that emerged from the distinct medium we employed. Instead of the soft bite of graphite on paper, the less sympathetic ballpoint nib of a Wacom inkling pen slid across the paper surface with less control. The value of choosing this medium, however, was to allow the simultaneous digitization of marks as we drew on the page. Each digitized stroke, transformed into a vector line, could now be picked up and moved. They were first separated out on a page and subsequently underwent a material transformation. We cut the lines from sheets of adhesive vinyl to create material kits of lines that could be organized on the page to acquire new meaning. The image on the left shows our version of Michaud's strokes translated into their material form. 5 of these kits of lines were produced to become 5 poems, and 5 small vinyl objects were produced as a byproduct of this process. Each object, only around 3.5 centimeters in diameter, was the incidental outcome of preparing the adhesive lines. The cuts made by the blades sit at the threshold between these positive and negative shapes, underlining their relationship to one another. The same edges, derived from a single set of strokes, are discernible in both the objects and the kits of lines. However, through their random accumulation as a 3-dimensional forms, their legibility, as with Michaud's drawings, remains elusive. Each identical kit of lines was transformed into a different poem. By using every line within the constraints of an A4 page, this final translation, in our chain of processes, sought to incorporate the material totality of Michaud's original asemic text. Alongside each poem, a meticulous drawing of the vinyl object was produced. Together, each set of poems and drawings constitutes a complete translation of a single sheet of cut adhesive vinyl, generated with reference to Michaud's alphabet. If, as Walter Benjamin wrote, the task of a translator is not to come as close as possible to the literal translation of the original text, but to interpret, even intuit, another meaning adjacent to the original, that is nevertheless faithful to the original, we are applying this notion of literary translation to a body of work that responds to the ambition to reconcile drawing and writing through line. Although the naturalness of strange things had a clear ambition to connect writing and drawing through processes of translation, we had inadvertently produced a group of poem objects that relate back to the examples of Breton and Queneau. The outcomes here are resolutely static, but they emerge from an iterative process in which the same starting point leads to a plurality of outcomes. To develop our prototype interface, we have worked with a lightweight black card, simply switching the vinyl cutter for a flatbed plotter cutter. The new object makes use of the same Illustrator file, scaled up by 400%, with the capacity to produce much larger lines, letterforms, and objects. The audience can discover and explore the poem through picking up and moving the object, creating a unique playback of the poem through their interaction. The audio recording of the poem playback is on loop. There is a simple one-to-one mapping between the senses and the resulting sound, making it easier for the user to understand the relationship between movement and audio. For example, an increase in movement, i.e. the acceleration, equals an increase in volume. Other effects include reverb, delay, and resonators. The vibrating motor that is activated and controlled through the acceleration of the movement enables another translation of the poem that further enhances the experience of interaction. The responsive tactile feedback from the objects allows the user to engage towards a gesture of reading of the poem. The outer layer consists of the shapes generated by our translation process, which are cloaking a plastic sphere containing a polystyrene sphere within which the relevant hardware is nested and securely playtested. Through the video, you are experiencing the audio, but obviously not the vibrotactile qualities the user experiences. The real-time interactivity of it is important to us with this latest translation and iteration. My breath, shriek, we wash but not sleep. My breath, unless the melody, the sweat, we washed up in the underworld, drowned but not yet wet. Sleeping in you, I hold my breath. You sleep your poetry under us, the melody, the sweat. We washed up in the underworld, but not yet wet. Sleeping in you, I hold you. In this presentation, we propose a creative use of technology that looks at the relationship between the reader and the object and how the reader's experience can be enhanced. We are also proposing the term gesture reading, which suggests that dynamic gesture is necessary to read the content of this publication, and simultaneously the poem object reads these gestures, translating them into audio and vibrotactile feedback to further augment the sensory experience. Our next step is to develop the work as an interactive installation comprising multiple poem objects. First, we aim to test new forms of material realization, which will have an impact on the tactile experience of the reader. The material needs to be malleable but durable to withstand sustained interaction. The alternative is to use a different process altogether, such as 3D printing, that produces its own leftovers. Second, we will look into how vibrotactile feedback can be explored further, for example, through network gesture reading, where multiple objects interact and influence each other, and how multiple objects might work together in the same environment. For example, two readers synchronizing their gestures in order to read a poem. In addition, we can explore how audiences experience the gesture reading, that is, how vibrotactile feedback can be experienced by the audience. What, for example, occurs if the audio is removed altogether and the poem is experienced purely through a series of vibrations? I Am Not Listening is a continuing investigation centering on translation, from line to word to audio to vibration, and operates between physical and digital realms, where each process of translation offers new challenges, new possibilities, and new readings. Thank you for listening.